Great. So I have the pleasure today to introduce Dr. Tricia Bent-Goodley. Dr. Bent-Goodley is a professor emeritus at Howard University School of Social Work and a graduate professor of public health in the Howard University Graduate School. Dr. Bent-Goodley is a researcher and licensed clinical social worker with over 25 years of experience in mental health, administrative, and educational roles. Her research, administrative, and clinical career have included a specialized focus on addressing trauma and violence with a focus on community-based interventions. She has developed academic and student support programs in her tenure at Howard University, working to support the intellectual, social, emotional, and spiritual development of undergraduate, graduate, and professional students. Prior to coming to Howard, Dr. Bent-Goodley served as an administrator of a countywide family violence prevention program, managing mental health, clinical care, case management, psychoeducational groups, and concrete services. Since then, Dr. Bent-Goodley obtained external funding and served as the founding director of the Howard University Interpersonal Violence Prevention Program. Office of the Provost, the office dedicated to providing sexual assault, dating and domestic violence, and stalking prevention, education, advocacy, intervention, policy development, coordination, and bystander education. The program was noted as a national model during her tenure as director. She serves as a consulting editor for several scholarly journals and distinctly in a number of local, state, and national elected and appointed leadership positions. Dr. Bent-Goodley and I met several years ago, probably at least 10 years ago, when we were both involved with the Department of Justice grant to reduce sexual violence on campuses. I would just like to share that we talk about building community partnerships, and Dr. Bent-Goodley gave of herself. She actually supported me by sharing her grant proposal in order to help us to apply independently for the Department of Justice grant. So I really want to acknowledge that. That is very rare that you find an educator or researcher willing to share and give of themselves and share their works. And so I will always remember her for that kindness and supportive way that she showed mentoring to me. And I appreciate her. So please help me to welcome Dr. Tricia Bent-Goodley. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wuta. I appreciate that so much. I have to say, I also see a couple of remarks from some of my students in the chat, and there is nothing that makes you feel better, at least for me, than being able to give back to our students, and being able to give back to women and help us position ourselves to bring somebody else behind us. So I'm just incredibly proud of that introduction. That makes me feel so good. So thank you so much, and thanks to some of my students in the chat who are making me feel good on a rainy Thursday morning. Thank you so much. So I'm going to share my screen here and get us kicked off. I'm super excited to be able to be with you all. If someone would have told me last year that I did decent enough to get a second invite, I would never have believed it. So I really appreciate that you all have invited me back again. What an incredible honor. I do not take it lightly. And I'm really hoping that I'll be able to speak to this incredible theme of being bold and being courageous, strengthening our community connections to end sexual violence. So really, I want us to first start by taking a minute and just being grateful. We have made it to November the 12th, 2020, and guess what? we are still here. Some years I would not have even given that another thought. But if 2020 did not make you more aware of being grateful for life, I don't know what else would do it. So I don't care if you're home by yourself. I don't care if you have to, for a minute, interrupt that child that might be learning remotely near you, or if you are in the office. Clap for yourself and celebrate yourself. We definitely do not do that often enough. Now, I don't see all of you, but some of you are not clapping for yourself. Give yourself a round of applause. I am calling this a family conversation because we've been together more than once now. And well, it's 2020. I think we could all use a virtual hug. We want to embrace this conversation as a family conversation because, to be honest, I may say some things that might be a bit challenging, but it's done in the spirit of the conference theme. What a year it's been since we last saw each other. Last year, the conference theme was centered around hope. And boy, did we need that this last year. We needed every bit of hope with all of the events of 2020, between the pandemic, the election, the post-election, and what we see on the ground in our communities. We needed to be anchored in hope. This pandemic did not create what we saw. This pandemic just revealed what many of us knew already existed. The violence that we see, the pain we see in a lot of our communities, the profound isolation of particular populations, the inequities that we see harbored within those social determinants of health that we talk about so often. All of that has been there. And you all have seen it firsthand and up close. Some of you have been working remotely, which has presented its own set of challenges. Some of you have had to physically go into work while people within your own office worked from home. This too presented its own set of challenges. But regardless of where you were or how you did it, you prevailed. I could not leave it to any other group to have the best theme possible as we prepare to move from 2020 to 2021, bold and courageous, strengthening community connections to end sexual violence. Here's the thing, courage is found in some of the most unlikely places. I'm going to spend a little bit of time today talking about that. But first, my goals. Courtney McFadden did a great job of talking about the why. She laid out the statistics, and those are so important for us to understand the patterns that we see. But I have 3 goals here today. One is to explore strategies to really help our communities grow and work together to end sexual violence, to think about how we really have those strategies connected to community. I want to talk about what community is, and then to really encourage you to be bold and courageous in the work that you're doing on the ground. Let me start by saying this. Courage does not mean you don't get afraid. Courage means you do not let fear stop you. For a lot of you, that is what you worked through this last year. You had to press on when other people were home and continue to work. For some of you, your living rooms, your kitchens, and your dining rooms or bedrooms all of a sudden became the place that you were delivering trauma services. Think about that for a minute. And every day you had to sit, see, and feel the pressure and the weight of that and not be able to escape it, even within your own home. For others, the fear of having to go into work and expose yourselves and your families to the possibility of contracting this virus, that was your burden. And some of us had to, as we were helping our clients, we too were battling through the very same issues of loss of family members, testing positive and surviving COVID ourselves, and having to fight through the isolation and the loss associated with COVID, with losing contact with friends and family members. We too were isolated even as we did this work. We were still having to help our own children with remote learning as we were helping others do the same. Listen, courage doesn't mean you don't get afraid. Courage means you don't let fear stop you. You did not let fear stop you. You kept fighting, you kept persevering and pressing forward. And for that, there is a community that is grateful. J.R.R. Tolkien said that courage is found in unlikely places. That is the truth for sure. Some of us began to see and find our own sense of courage in this pandemic in ways we could have never anticipated. So here are some things we know for many of you working on the ground. We had to be flexible and fluid. Initially, we saw survivors trying to figure out how they were going to manage and work around the pandemic to be able to get help. For example, initially hotline numbers saw those calls going down, and then they shot back up. So we had to really be very agile in our ability to respond. We have seen the numbers of sexual and domestic violence go up during this pandemic. This is not unusual in natural disasters for us to see these kinds of spikes. We are still in this pandemic. We still are in it. And so there's a whole lot more that we have to learn, that we're going to continue to learn. We won't really fully know and understand all of what it is that we're seeing for some time. And so it's important for us to really be cognizant and aware of all the different things that we're processing throughout the day. Here are some other things that we're seeing. We're seeing that the level of violence or the type of violence is becoming more violent. Some of us are seeing levels of violence that we've not seen before. And this is something that we have to pay real close attention to, and try not only to learn, to learn more about, but to be responsive all at the same time. In some ways, we are building the plane as we're flying it. So these challenges, they're very compelling. And having strong and effective community engagement could not be more paramount, more important, and more challenging all at the same time. We've gone from being physically in spaces to now having to remotely access them. And for a lot of the people we serve, they may not even be able to do that. We are zoomed out. Some of you have exposed parts of yourself on a Zoom because you didn't know the camera was on. Some of you are still working through muting and unmuting yourselves. I mean, it was cool at first, but now you hear someone say, let's Zoom. And you're like, can we do something else? Can we just do a regular old phone call? I see everybody out there who's thinking what I'm thinking when I hear that. I have spent considerable time since April talking to providers about what they're seeing on the ground and how they're managing what they're seeing. I've also spent time talking with community members about what they're experiencing on the ground and what they believe could be done better to serve communities. So the thoughts that I'm giving you today are largely based on this on-the-ground, community-based research that we've been able to do since April as we have been experiencing this pandemic. So how do we strengthen community connections to end sexual violence at a time when some of us cannot physically even be in community in the way that we are most accustomed? I want to offer some ideas and some suggestions about how we go about doing this at a time when things are significantly challenged and changed and different. And let me say this to you all. I have approached this work as an opportunity to find ways to be better and to do things in a more excellent way, as opposed to feeling as if there are things that I just cannot do anymore because of the fact that we can't get physically into some communities. Let me say that if you had an embattled relationship with the community before, then you're only going to see that magnified now. It is challenging to build connections with a community if you've not already had some connectedness during this time. But that doesn't make it impossible. It's just a challenge. So consider it an opportunity to be more excellent. Now, here's an advantage. A lot of you are not just working with the community, you are of the community. You're from the communities that you serve. Many of you live in the community, you're part of the life of the community. And so that, I think, gives you some increased opportunities. So the first thing I would say is we have to know the difference between our grassroots organizations and our nonprofit organizations. Too often we confuse these two things. The nonprofit organization may not be a community-based organization. Now, I told you at the beginning that there may be some things that I say that might be a little unsettling. Hear me out. If you oftentimes want to hear from the community, you may have to target those grassroots organizations, not necessarily the not-for-profit, or maybe not necessarily the not-for-profit organization alone. I know that might be offensive to some, but this is the honest truth, and we hear this across the country as we're talking to communities of color. Too often we use the word community loosely, and because of that, we misdirect our focus. At a time like this, when you need to get the word out, you need to have the relationships with your grassroots organizations, the people on the ground who may not be the most structured, they may not be the most organized, they may not have a bunch of letters behind their names, but my goodness, they've been doing this forever in the community and they know the community. They have the connections to the people that you're trying to impact. Here is the next thing to think about. We have to know who the actual leaders are in our communities. Not just the people who are noted as leaders, not just our public elected officials or the person that maybe people continue to put up forth as the community leader. I learned this early on working with faith-based communities, that a lot of times it would always be a little lady sitting in the second pew who was there every single week, and it was her, and she was the driver of everything going on in that faith-based community. It wasn't the designated leaders, it wasn't the people who had titles, it wasn't them. It was just that little lady sitting there in the second pew. So it's important for us to know who are the leaders in our community. Who do people really listen to? We should know who they are, and we should be working to help them serve as messengers to address some of the challenges that we are seeing in our community. A lot of time we wonder why we have 5 people show up to an event. And often it's because we're not engaged with the people that the community views as its leaders. This takes work, but we have to know who those individuals are and the work that they're doing in the community. So relationship building with our grassroots leadership is so critical. And if we are working with our grassroots organizations, then it's highly possible that some of those designated community leaders, persons who the community has designated as a leader, are connected to those grassroots organizations. As I get to close out some of my research I've been doing around the country, the one thing I've learned is that communities of color are still providing for themselves. So for some of you, I'm going to take you back to some of your social welfare history classes. If you're a social worker, you know, we learned about social welfare history. And one of the things that we learned, particularly in African American social welfare history, was that there was always a mutual aid network, right? Folks who were doing the work in the community. And one thing that we have been seeing very strongly in the work that we're doing, and as we talk to different communities, is there is still a strong mutual aid network in our community. We assume folks are not going to know how to help us in ways that we want help. And so a lot of times we go to people in the places that are most available to us. I remember one person in our project said, you guys don't have somebody that I can go to at 1 o'clock in the morning when I am just overwhelmed with grief and hurt and heartache, but I can go to so-and-so's house and so-and-so is going to open her door and she's going to be there to support me. And so-and-so, because she's been doing this so long, she has a network of other women, other people in the community who are going to show up when I need them. So we have to know these mutual aid networks exist. The places where we see less barriers and more people who not only look like us, but understand our story are there in those mutual aid networks. We as providers have to begin to find ways to honor this mutual aid network that really is the history of largely the culture of many communities of color. We have always had an alternative framework. And so it's important for us to honor and support that as opposed to trying to alter, change, or disrupt it. But that also means we need to know it exists and that it may not be perfect, but it is present. So it's really important as we're trying to strengthen community connections to know what's the grassroots organization presence, who has the community designated as leaders, and what are the mutual aid networks that exist in the community. Now here's something else we've learned. And again, I'm giving you warning. I might step on some toes with this one. One of the things that we know is that our faith-based community has been a bedrock for support and help in many communities of color, especially right now. But what my research has shown me this time around, and this is, I've done a similar version of this study 20 years ago, and it's been interesting to see this conversation change in some ways. What I've learned this time around is that there's a crack that's growing where more and more survivors are realizing that they cannot turn to their faith-based community. Yes, there are still many that do, without question, but that does not mean that they're getting what they need. So when we come to this point of engaging communities, I think that we have to not only see our faith-based communities as a space of support, but also as a space of defiance in being responsive to the needs of survivors of sexual violence and of domestic violence. Or they just may not have the capacity to help or help beyond their doors. So I heard a lot of folks say in communities, they only help the people that are in their faith-based community. They don't have enough time to help those of us who are around in the community. We have to begin to hold our faith-based organizations accountable in a different way. I think as women of color, we have given our faith-based organizations a pass because of what they mean to us, and I get that. However, the stakes are so high. In my study, I heard more and more women being turned away from their faith, feeling shunned by their faith, and their religious community because they chose to no longer be a victim. I do not have the answer to this. I don't. But it's clear and it's apparent to me that if we're going to be about community, some of us are going to have the courage to challenge our faith-based institutions around a lot of issues that connect back to sexual violence. And one of those issues, interestingly enough, is mental health. We have to be invested in having that hard, sticky, what might even feel like a divisive conversation in some ways. It could turn into something that feels a little ugly, not a positive conversation. But it's important if we're going to be about building community connections and conducting the kinds of culturally responsive, widespread prevention, intervention, bystander education that is so desperately needed to reduce and eliminate sexual and domestic violence in our communities. So I'm going to move from that faith-based piece because I know I may have felt a little discomforting, but it's critical and it's important we begin to have that conversation. And I believe women of color, we are the best ones to start it. Here's the next thing that I'm going to say, that it probably may not be as popular, but again, our theme is being bold and courageous. We have got to begin to look at this next generation of young people and give them the space to grow in the field and in the work. That means some of us have to step aside to mentor and give up a little power and give up a little recognition so that we are intentionally building intergenerational conversations and ensuring that the fight will continue when we are no longer in it. Some of you are saying, Tricia, I'm going to be in this fight forever. Well, God bless you people. I am not going to be in this fight forever. At some point, I am going to sit down. I'm going to give advice. I'm going to make contributions, but I will not be in the day-to-day fight. And I want to know that there are people who will be equally, if not more committed and capable to get the job done. To do that, I have to make the necessary adjustments right now. Young people can help us build community connections in some new ways. Social media is still a second language for me, as an example. Young people can help us grow in this space, and they can help us tackle some of these issues in new ways that we've not thought of yet. At the same time, young people need to be willing to listen and learn, because there is a lot that we have learned along the way. I mean, listen, there's a lot you learn as you continue to move forward in years of having done this work. And so we want to be able to pass this on so we can catapult the work forward. But we also have to have our young people in a posture of being able to honor that there's some stuff we know because we lived through it. And we not only want to give it to you, we want to make sure you're prepared to handle it. We all have a role to play. Speaking of social media, this is another way to think about how we are building community connections right now. A lot of people thought that doing community work was just done and there was no way to do it during this pandemic. I had that conversation with so many providers. They just couldn't in their minds think, how can I do prevention education now? How can I do bystander education or even create awareness? A lot of people thought that doing community work was just done and there was no way to do it during a pandemic. I believe the pandemic has actually opened up even more options of how we work and can engage and build community. I watched organizations create YouTube channels with engaging and interesting content. I have seen some amazing Twitter chats that have been engaging and created community, expanded our sense of community, grown our sense of community. I have seen education efforts that have been automated by graphic images. I marvel at people who can do that. I have no clue how to do it, but it looks so amazing. And they have been interesting and they have been engaging and fun to watch on subjects that are tough to process. I've seen organizations tap into people from all across the country without impacting their budget one bit. This level of building community beyond Zoom has been really fascinating to watch. And I know that there are even more opportunities for us to engage in productive prevention and intervention efforts. We're just tapping the surface. Here is the other thing that I'm going to repeat from last year, and that is that building community requires the belief and the value that culture really does matter. It matters who the messenger is. We have heard this countless times in our research, and in fact found that some people felt like being trauma-informed meant having someone who was sitting across from them who really understood the nature of the trauma of just being a person of color in America, especially in recent years. We cannot divorce cultural context from engaging communities. It has to be infused into that work, not an add-on, not a burden, but an opportunity to honestly and creatively engage communities. Now, let me be clear in saying that if you are not a person of color, it does not mean you cannot do that work. But it does mean that you have to have a strong sense of yourself, your privilege, how you operate in this world, and how that shows up for other people. And then you have to have the skill set to be able to be honestly and authentically in a position to manage those things. Let me also be clear and say that just because you are a person of color, that does not mean that you are better positioned or culturally competent by virtue of being you in your work. It's important you too have to know how you show up for people who do or do not share your experience or do not look like you. And you too have to have the skill set to know how to embrace it and manage it. These ideas all together are important for us if we are ever going to change the challenges that we see in building connections with and within our communities. If we honestly want to be about the work of ending sexual violence, ending domestic violence, ending sex trafficking in our communities, then we have got to be about the business of being our authentic selves. We have got to be bold and courageous in our hiring practices. We have got to be bold and courageous in our programming and outreach. We have got to be bold and courageous in what we fund, who we fund, and how we fund community efforts. We have got to be bold and courageous in asking ourselves questions. How can I truly be better? How do I do this work better? The question I always ask myself every day, how can I do this better today than I did it the day before? How am I going to be better on Thursday than I was on Wednesday? We have got to be bold and courageous, even in our approaches to this work. We have got to be bold and courageous in our thinking and in our willingness to try new things, to do something differently, to expand the ways in which we engage the work we're called to engage in. So I started out by talking about courage, and I hope I reminded you that courage means you don't let fear stop you, and that many of us have found our courage in the most unlikely place of 2020. I want to begin to close out my remarks. I did want to leave a little bit of time if there are questions in the chat, but I wanted to close out by reminding you to not be afraid to be bold. Being bold means that you have a belief beyond what you can see, that you are standing on something bigger than yourself, that you are believing even when you cannot see it. If this year has not taught us anything, we have surely got to be bold. Being bold means that we are steady and sure when everything else around us looks like it's falling apart. Boldness means that we must stand when everybody else around us is shrinking. Boldness means that we believe even when everything looks like it is stacked up against us. Boldness means when you need to take a break and get your whole life together, that you take a break and get the whole thing together. And know that the things around you, they're not going anywhere. They will still be there when you get back. Boldness is showing self-care. Being bold is trying something new when everyone else is doing the same old thing. Boldness is being who you are in a place that does not honor who you are. Freedom lies in being bold. Boldness says, I used to be afraid of the dark until I learned that I am a light in the dark, and the dark is afraid of me. My sisters, and maybe my brothers out there, of boldness and courage, I wish you grace in this next leg of your journey. I wish you peace so that you can keep on keeping on. I wish you boldness so that you can actually see who you really are and who you are becoming. And I wish you the courage so that no matter what is in front of you, you will push past that fear and continue to be great and do great things for our communities. Be bold, be courageous. Thank you. Thank you all so much. I'm going to open this up for any questions that anyone might have. And I am looking in the chat. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, thank you, thank you. My goal was to inspire you this morning. We've got a lot of work to do, and we've got to take care of ourselves as we do it. And so I hope that I've given you some inspiration to take this thing to the next. We don't know what 2021 will bring, but we've got hope. We are bold, and now we have some serious courage. I think that we're going to be all right. And because of that, so will our communities. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, thank you. I appreciate it. Yes, you are the light. You absolutely are the light. Yes, you really are. I'm so glad that you heard that and received it. Because without you all doing this work, our communities would really be suffering in a whole different way. I'm really grateful for all of you. Yes, this recording, I believe you will still have access to it. Thanks, everyone. I do appreciate you. I believe that too, but I wasn't going to say it. And thank you for telling me I didn't age. I really needed that one. Can I get a printout copy of that, Dr. Wuta? Courage is taking care of yourselves. Yes. And I really want to stress that point with you all. That is so important that you're taking care of yourselves to do this work. I heard from so many providers who were in the exact same place as their clients were, but yet providing incredible services to folks, even as they were struggling with the very same things. I mean, you all are my heroes. I know that a lot of times we're not recognized as first responders. Each of you are first responders on the front lines, getting the job done, getting the work done. And, again, my hats just go off to you because you were managing a whole lot. I hope, I heard Courtney took her, she's on leave, she's on vacation. I know a lot of us are feeling we can't take vacation in the way we really want to right now, but do take some time for yourself to be able to really nourish yourselves, nourish your mind, your body, and your spirit. Hi, Raina. I did see you. Welcome from the West Coast. It's good to see you here. Can I speak a little bit more about having difficult conversations with church leaders and nonprofit organizations? And then the other question there, guidance for managing balance in this season. All right, I'm going to take that first question first. Managing balance in this season. So one of the things that I made a decision to do during this time, I decided that I was going to mentally think about working out as a gift.
I hate it.
So what I would say to myself is working out is a gift. And I said it, I think somebody has to mute.
I don't know if I was always sensitive.
I think we can hear somebody.
Or if I just never acknowledged that aspect of it. Because I know how to hold my own.
I'm sorry.
But
Can you please mute your computers, everyone?
I think everybody was just unmuted.
Sort of a conversations in the back.
Yes, for some reason, a lot of us are unmuted now, so if you could just mute yourselves. Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. So what I did was I started to say to myself every morning, wow, I love working out. It's a time for me to feel good, to take care of myself, to take care of my mind, to take care of my body and my spirit. And I can't wait till I can work out. Now, at that time, I did not believe that. I was telling myself a story. I was not necessarily feeling that way. But what I started to do is, the more that I would say that to myself and start, really engaging in that workout, here we are, what is it, 6, 7, 8 months later, I actually, if I don't work out, if I don't get on the elliptical, if I don't take a walk, I actually feel like I lost something. So it really is now a part of my life. I get up, I don't wonder if I'm going to work out. I know 5 days a week I'm doing something. And then the other 2 days I miss it if I'm not doing some type of workout. And I use that time to not think about anything, to think about things, to just process what's going on, to let my body relax, because I didn't realize how much tension I was building in my body from the day of work. So I'm sitting like this all day, not realizing that I'm not relaxed. And so that's what it's helped me to do. So what I would say to you all about the balance, be intentional. Do not plan everything else and not plan that time for yourself. What I say is, my day will not get the best of me if I don't get in a solid 30 to 45 minutes, depending on what's going on. So in other words, I build my day around my workout. I don't have a set time, but I know that it will get done. Last night I got in from work late, and guess what? I was on the elliptical at 9:15. I was like, I'm getting this in. I don't care what happens. And my husband was waiting for me. My son was waiting for me. I'm like, sorry, y'all are gonna have to wait because I got to get in this 30 minutes. So the more that we are intentional about prioritizing ourselves, the more that we begin to balance different, and the more that we begin to say no to things that we should be saying no to, that we just say yes to because we're so accustomed to saying yes and we don't want people to be hurt, the easier balance becomes. To the other question of how do we have these difficult conversations in our communities, I think that it starts with, we have to understand something about the faith-based providers in our communities. So for example, you really have to study those providers. For some of those providers, you know, they may be working in their faith-based organization part-time, and they might have a whole nother full-time job. So if it's a situation like that, they may not have the time or the resources to really be engaged on this issue. If that's the case, then how you work with that group might look a little bit different. There you might provide more resources in helping them and educating them about what's going on. Then you have mega churches, mega organizations. And in those situations, you may have to study the structure. You may have to study the priorities of that faith-based community. You may need to know a little bit about their ministries. You may need to understand something about their particular faith, their particular religious doctrine, and approach them from that perspective, where you're coming with a certain knowledge about who they are and what's important to them, and then start the conversation there. What I've learned in having worked with faith-based communities for the last 20 years now is that a lot of times they don't realize you know, how much their work is connected to sexual and domestic violence. And what I would say to them is that there's really nothing you're doing in your ministries that doesn't connect back. If you have a health ministry, if you have a prison ministry, if you have a mental health ministry, if you have a youth ministry, whatever ministry you have, I can talk to you about how these issues and dynamics are present. And in doing that, I can tell you how we can begin to have this conversation in a different way. Now, I am not a biblical scholar or scholar of other faith doctrine. And so that's where I would bring in folks who really know, understand the doctrine of the church to be able to be there to help us to try to have the conversation. And then the last thing I would say is building relationship. You know, for me, when I first started working in faith-based communities, my family had to come with me because they wanted to know who I was. They wanted to understand me, and they felt like they would know me if they could see my family. So my husband and my boys would be right there in different, you know, services, masses, so that, you know, the religious organizations could kind of get to know who I was. Relationship building is so key. We do everything in relationship. So we have to value that relationship to be able to really have those honest conversations. You can't have an honest conversation without relationship. I see that there's some other questions.
Yes, so this is Aisha from Bowie State. I'll read 2 other questions to you.
Awesome.
The first, I am struggling to find ways for a national nonprofit to connect with communities of color whom they have historically not connected with. Any suggestions on where to start?
Well, I would say to start with those national or, you know, noted people of color who might be doing the work. So I'll say it like this, for my students, my doctoral students, I would always say to them that whenever they would write a paper, for example, I would always challenge them to find who are the voices, who are the people of color who are writing in the work that you're doing. You should know who they are, right? And then you don't hesitate in reaching out and asking them more questions and building a relationship. So what I would say to that national organization is, who are the people of color doing this work? And reach out to them and maybe ask, who else is doing the work in this particular place or location? Because that goes back to our own mutual network. One of my mentors, Iris Carlton-Lene, she writes about it like this. She talks about there being a web of affiliation, and that is true. What she said is that there's a web of affiliation, particularly in African-American communities. Many of us who do the work know each other, in other words, and we have relationships. So it really is, if you are linking up with folks who are doing the work and asking them to kind of help facilitate conversation, I think that's one way to do it. But note this, you have to build trust with them, because there's no way that I would open up my network to a person I don't have relationship with. Relationship building is a lost art, but of critical importance. We're so accustomed to building relationship on a text now or through an email now. And I'm not saying that that can't happen, but there's something to when a person that you have a relationship with asks you to step up for them. You step up sometimes without even fully knowing what they might be asking you for. And a lot of times that's because of the relationship you have. So I would say get to know some of those folks who are talking and doing the work, and not just at the national level, but at the grassroots level. And if those folks who are doing the work nationally, if they don't know who the grassroots people are, then that might tell you something about them too, as to where they are in some of that work.
Thank you. And the next question, how do we connect with communities like the Piscataway Indigenous communities and other communities of color that are deeply overlooked? How do we build trust with those grassroots groups as nonprofits that have historically hurt, abused, ignored those Indigenous groups?
So the first thing that I would say is you have to give people the time and the space to not trust you. And you have to manage that feeling. It's not really for them to manage that feeling. The way that I say it is this. When I first started working I first started my career in child welfare, and I was working in Central Harlem, which at that time had the highest rate of children who were being removed from their homes. When I would go into community to work with people, they told me outright they didn't trust me. Sometimes they didn't open their door. Sometimes they cursed me out. Sometimes they talked to me, but they have talked to me, I'm gonna say people of color, Black folks are part of our survival strategy is knowing how to say something without saying everything. And so part of what I learned in that experience was just because I looked like the people I served, they didn't trust me because I had a degree and I was coming from an agency and I was coming from a place that historically devalued and discriminated against them. So the way I approached that relationship was to start out by saying, I understand why you have the feeling you feel. I get it. And give me the opportunity to prove to you that that's not how I'm going to work with the community. And if I do something and you don't like it, hold me accountable to it and let's talk it through. So it started with me acknowledging what the reality is. It started me with acknowledging their truth and not holding it against them, but saying, my shoulders are broad enough and I'm deeply invested enough to be able to deal with the mistrust that's coming at me. And so part of it is, once you've acknowledged that, the next part of it is doing the work every day. So for me, I was in community every day. I was where the community was. I did my job, but I spent a whole lot of time at bodegas. This is in New York, which are like corner stores, so to speak, I guess here. So I spent a lot of time in bodegas. I went to faith-based services. Sometimes I was in a faith-based service. I didn't even speak the language, but I was present. I was there. I was at the park. I spent a lot of time in the community, just showing up, not coming there to speak, not coming there to have a presence, but just to be present and seen. And because of that, the community embraced me. And it took time, and it took me being consistent. So I would say to the person who asked that question, that it takes that level of investment. I also knew something about the community, but there were also communities I didn't know about. In Central Harlem at that time, we had a very large Puerto Rican and Dominican community. And so I had to learn, what's different about the Puerto Rican community versus the Dominican community. I had to learn those things. I had to invest in that myself. I didn't just go to the community and say, hey, can you tell me about you? I did the work myself. And I think that made them feel better because they could see what I was doing. So in other words, I think, these are some of the strategies that we have to employ when we're trying to engage communities. I'm seeing a comment there. In Southern Maryland, we're very fortunate to have a grassroots program. Yeah. So again, going back to what I was saying earlier, linking with our grassroots leadership, linking with our grassroots organization, but I can't overemphasize, it starts with us doing the work and having the patience and the skill and the level of investment to keep being present, even when people tell you to kick rocks.
Okay, and as we wrap up, we do have one more comment. All other questions and comments will be forwarded directly to Dr. Bent-Goodley for response. So if you have any questions, you can still continue to put them into the chat room. We'll go ahead and save it and send it to Dr. Bent-Goodley as suggested. I did mention that it would be from Jennifer Marino, but it'll be from Deidre Church. Thank you so much, Dr. Bent-Goodley. As a Black woman violently raped by a Black man who was never arrested despite my efforts, I sometimes feel erased by how there seems to be so little effort put into holding rapists accountable. Currently in progressive circles, it sometimes seems that we often are more concerned with protecting Black and brown men from the police than protecting Black women and holding men in our community who choose to rape accountable. Throughout our history of fighting for civil rights, we declared no justice, no peace. How can we recognize that justice is also a critical part of healing and peace for Black, brown victims?
Thank you so much for that really important and critical question. And, I'm really happy to be able to end my thoughts on this. There's something that we talk a lot about in domestic violence work, and that is racial loyalty. It's this idea that too often, we as Black people and Black women are socialized to always put our race before our gender, to put, particularly to protect Black men. That's how we're socialized. And so I think that the way that it starts is we have to hold ourselves accountable. So the way I always approach this work is, yes, there's work that systems need to do, absolutely. But there's work we need to do. We have to, within our community, challenge the stereotypes that exist. We in our community, as mothers, have to challenge our sons. I can't tell you how many times, and I'm a mother of 2 boys, and I can't tell you how often we as moms ignore some of the things our sons are doing, but push our daughters to be better. And this is something we've got to think about and examine. The other piece is, as a community, is to think about the stereotypes that exist about Black women and what we need to do to address those stereotypes and to change the way we think about ourselves, to change how we socialize Black women and Black men, and to make everybody's responsibility taking care of each other, not just Black women's responsibility to do that. So I think that we need to have our own conversation really around how we better protect each other, and know that when we don't allow a Black man to be accountable for his actions, we dishonor not only ourselves, but our community, because we all have the potential to be better. And if people just allow us to do whatever it is that we want to do, none of us gets to be the better version of ourselves, and we actually hurt our community at the same time. So I think we have to begin to have that broader conversation around race, around class, around gender. I'll end by saying this really quickly. You know, it was Ida B. Wells Barnett that said, you know, it's not going to be other people that really tear us down. It's going to be the divisions around gender and class that will be the game changer in our community. The blessing is we can do something about that. So thank you for your question.
And thank you, Dr. Bent-Goodley, for giving us so much to think about as we work to build our community connections, for reminding us what it means to be courageous, what it means to be bold, and for setting the tone for our meeting today. Thank you, thank you, thank you.